She thinks that she was impregnated by an owl from a dream that she had, who used to help women poison their husbands, collecting tiny bones and talking to ghosts. Hi friends, welcome back to my channel. My name is Lauren, you may also call me Lo, and today's video is my October wrap-up, or all the books that I read in October. So thank you so much for being here. I hope you're doing well, and let's get on into it. In October, I read a total of 10 books and 2,855 pages. Of those pages, 1,120 were from listening to audiobooks, and 1,735 were from physically reading. And the average book length was 286 pages, so I read a lot of shorter books this month. 8 of the 10 books were adult and 2 were YA, and 4 were horror, 3 were fantasy, 1 was a historical fiction, 1 was a sci-fi, and 1 was a romance. When it comes to ratings, I rated 6 books 3 stars and 4 books 4 stars for an average of 3.4 stars. So this is a pretty, I want to say average-ish reading month. I didn't have any 2 stars or any 5 stars. 4 and 3 I still recommend, so I recommend all the books that I'm going to talk to you about this month, but I'd say it was a pretty average month. So, getting into the books, the first book I finished in October was Chouette by Claire Oshetsky. This is probably the weirdest book I've ever read, so buckle up. So we're following our main character, Tiny, who gets pregnant, but she doesn't believe that her husband impregnated her. She thinks that she was impregnated by an owl from a dream that she had. Yeah. So basically, she spends her entire pregnancy trying to convince her husband that this is an owl baby, not a human baby, and her husband kind of just brushes it off. But when she has her baby, Chouette, which means owl in French, the baby is very owl-like and starts to behave very violently and strangely because she is part owl. And Tiny decides to kind of embrace Chouette and who she is and kind of her authentic self, and wants to kind of raise her as this human owl child, while her husband is continuously trying to find ways to fix Chouette and make her a normal child. So like I said, this is a very, very weird book, but I think at its core it's about motherly love. I think it's a book with a lot of symbolism and metaphor, and therefore I think it's kind of a literary fiction book, but I categorized it as horror because it really does feel like horror, at least it did to me. So in the end, I can't say I really enjoyed the book, but I also can't say that I didn't appreciate the book at all or didn't like the book at all. It's very much a 3-star book. The next book I read was Heartstopper Volume 4 by Alice Oseman. This is the kind of latest installment of the Heartstopper series, which is a graphic novel series. We're following 2 teenage boys, Nick and Charlie, as they kind of get to know each other and fall in love and have to navigate sexuality, coming out. And this book focuses a lot on self-harm and eating disorders and kind of getting through that and asking for help and all of those kinds of things. So I would say that there's a trigger warning in this one for eating disorders and self-harm. But as always, I think Alice Oseman handled a very serious topic in a very kind of, I guess, sensitive and effective way. And I really liked it. I really appreciated it. So this was a 4-star. I gave the first book in this series 5 stars and the rest 4 stars. I don't think the second, third, and fourth books are quite as good as the first one, but they are all very good. So I'd definitely recommend this series to anybody who has not started it yet, and you can access all of these books online for free, so you should read it. Next, I read In the Quick by Kate Hope Day. This book I talked about very extensively in my pink book reading vlog, which came out earlier in October. So go check that out if you want more like in the moment thoughts on this. I did talk about it quite a bit. But In the Quick follows our main character, June, who is under the custody growing up of her aunt and uncle. And she grows up very, very close to her uncle specifically. And her uncle has invented this fuel cell that basically powers spaceships. And he works for the National Space Program. And June kind of learns a little bit about like engineering and tinkering with him. And again, the two of them are super close until he passes away when June is probably like 10 or 12, I want to say. And June, in her grief, basically starts like tinkering with all sorts of machines in her aunt's house, and her aunt basically like sends her away to this school that's named after June's uncle. And it's basically like a school for children who want to become astronauts and want to be involved in the National Space Program. So she goes to astronaut school, and we basically follow her from childhood to adulthood as she becomes an astronaut. There's also sort of a mystery aspect of this book. There is a spaceship that basically gets lost, and it's like this mystery. And June kind of works throughout her life to try to figure out what happened to the people on that spaceship, because kind of the reason that that ship was lost is because the fuel cells that her uncle invented basically failed. This book is extremely character-driven and slow. I did enjoy kind of the day-to-day of like astronaut school and being an astronaut. That to me was actually like very interesting. I just didn't think there was really enough plot in this, and I really wanted it to focus on the mystery of the Inquiry, the ship that got lost. But it's really not about that. It's really like a character-driven book about June and June's life. So I have to say I didn't enjoy it as much as I could have. While I did really enjoy the kind of day-to-day astronaut stuff, there just wasn't enough happening for me in this book. This book is also often marketed as a romance, and there's like a short relationship at the end, but I'd say that this is very much not a romance book. So if you like character-driven stories and you want to get into sci-fi, I definitely would recommend this. It's like very unique as far as sci-fi goes in the fact that it's so slow and so character-driven. So some people I think would absolutely love this. For me, it was a 3-star book. The next book I read in October was The Lost Apothecary by Sarah Penner. This is a historical fiction book that in part takes place in Victorian England and in part takes place present day. So we're following Caroline, who goes to London alone because her husband has just cheated on her, and she's kind of processing that. And when she gets to London, she basically goes on this like tour, sort of, where people are digging up relics in the River Thames, and she discovers this vial from an old apothecary. And that discovery basically launches her investigation of this old Victorian apothecary who used to help women poison their husbands. We are also following said apothecary in Victorian London as she's kind of helping women who are like abused by their husbands or whose husbands are basically like controlling their lives by helping these women poison their husbands. So we have kind of alternating perspectives between Caroline and I don't remember her name, the apothecary's name, Nella. So it kind of alternates between Caroline and Nella's perspectives. I had a fun time reading this book, but my major critique is that Nella's kind of experiencing these things, and from her perspective we get what's actually going on, and then we get Caroline's perspective where she's like actively trying to discover what we already know because we have Nella's perspective. So in a lot of ways it was like, all right, Caroline, like come on, figure it out. Like We already know what's going on. You're the only one who doesn't. So there was some like frustrating aspect of it, and I think it's just the way that the book was structured that made it almost like repetitive and a little bit like frustrating. With that said, I did have a fun time reading it, but in the end it was just kind of okay. I wouldn't dissuade you from reading it, but for me it was just kind of middle of the road, 3 stars. Next, I read a very anticipated book for me, and that was Catherine House by Elizabeth Thomas. This is a dark academia horror book that follows our main character Ines, who basically gets accepted into this very mysterious and prestigious college called Catherine House. And Catherine House is very unique because the students there do not pay any tuition, but they have to basically give up their whole outside life for the years that they are in school at Catherine House. So that means they can't communicate with the outside world, they can't leave their campus, and in addition to that, there are all sorts of very stringent, kind of strange rules at the school. So on one hand, Ines kind of finds this community and kind of fits into this place, which is something she's never experienced in her life before. However, slowly but surely, she starts to feel the kind of heavy weight of all of the rules at Catherine House and starts to see herself as more of a prisoner than a student. As all of this is going on, we start to unravel this kind of strange agenda that the school has that has to do with its very unique and secretive, kind of most prestigious concentration. This book is really interesting because it's very confusing and very disorienting, but it all kind of contributes to this very atmospheric, very kind of abstract feeling that this book is supposed to give you. So in that way, I think all of that is done very well. And I'd say that this book is definitely more about atmosphere and like the feeling it gives you more than the actual plot. And it also demands a lot of kind of speculation and guesswork from the reader. So I did enjoy it, but I found the ending to be a little bit, I don't want to say anticlimactic, but just like unsatisfying. And it left a lot of questions unanswered, and I think that's intentional, but I didn't really like that. And I feel like the ending kind of failed me in this book. But I definitely would recommend it, and I definitely think it's like a good book. So this one was a 4-star. Next, I continued a series that I started earlier this year and never continued. So the book that I read was Children of Virtue and Vengeance by Tomi Adeyemi. This is the sequel to Children of Blood and Bone by Tomi Adeyemi, and I'm really glad I finally picked this book up. So, Children of Blood and Bone follows Zelly, who lives in this world where magic no longer exists. And on this very specific, very gruesome night, the kind of monarchy in this world killed off all the magi, or the people who could wield magic, sparing only the children. And at the time, Zelly was a small child, but her mother was killed. Since then, all of the magi who have white hair, so they look very distinct from other people, have been pretty persecuted and unable to fight back because they don't have magic anymore. And Zelly is given the opportunity to bring magic back and to kind of liberate her people from this persecution. That's all I'm going to give you for a summary. I don't want to spoil that book or this book, but this book obviously kind of picks up where the first one left off. And once again, this book was kind of just okay. It wasn't bad, it wasn't great. I gave the first book 3.5 stars, so I wasn't expecting this to be like super amazing. In the end, I gave this 3 stars. If you read Children of Blood and Bone and you're thinking about reading the sequel, I definitely wouldn't deter you from reading it. It definitely was worth reading, but this book mostly is training leading up to this kind of inevitable civil war. So it's not tremendously action-packed, and there isn't like as much of a plot, I guess, as there was in the first book. So once again, this was a 3-star book. The next book I read was an arc, and that was Into the Riverlands by Nghi, which is the third book in the Singing Hills cycle by Nghi, which is a series of novellas that follows our main character Chi, who is a cleric, and basically travels the world talking to various people and recording their stories. So the series has a very strong kind of storytelling element, which I think really makes it shine, and I absolutely love this series. So in the third book, Chi is traveling with an older couple and two young women to the Riverlands on foot. And as this kind of ragtag group of people is traveling, Chi learns about these kind of mythical martial artists who once inhabited the Riverlands. This book had less of a storytelling kind of element than the other books. It definitely was there, but I really wanted there to be more. But with that said, Nghi's writing was absolutely breathtaking. I love the characters in these books, and I really, really enjoyed myself while I was reading it. So I gave this one 4 stars. If you have not yet started this series, I highly, highly recommend it. I gave the first book, The Empress of Salt and Fortune, 5 stars, and I just think more people need to be reading these books. So highly, highly recommend them. The next book I read was perfect for October, and that was A Dowry of Blood by S.T. Gibson. This book is a retelling of Dracula's Brides, which is the part of this that I can't really speak on because I have not read Dracula, but I do not think you need to read Dracula to enjoy this book. So in this book, we're following Constanta, who is Dracula's first bride. And this book is basically a long letter that Constanta is writing Dracula. And we learn at the beginning of the book that Constanta has actually killed Dracula, and that she's not writing this story for Dracula, but kind of for herself, to tell her side of the story. And throughout this book, we learn the progression of events from Constanta meeting Dracula to Constanta killing Dracula many, many hundreds of years in the future. First of all, this book was so beautifully written. Like, truly some of the most breathtaking writing I've ever read. If S.T. Gibson writes any more books, I absolutely will pick them up. I don't believe that S.T. Gibson has written other books, but if they have, please correct me. I've never read a book before that discussed polyamory, or I guess included a polyamorous relationship, so that was a really interesting part of this book for me. And I think what really was cool to read about was that Dracula's spouses were all pretty much abused by Dracula in this book, and they kind of team up and like are able to comfort each other emotionally and kind of take care of each other and support each other, and that was a really awesome aspect of this book. Ultimately, it wasn't a 5-star book, but I really, really enjoyed myself while reading this. I highly recommend it, and I gave it 4 stars. The next book I read was Sundial by Catriona Ward. This was my first Catriona Ward book, and I do really want to read The Last House on Needless Street. It's very high up on my list. But this book follows Rob, who is very unhappily married to this man, and she has 2 daughters. And at the beginning of the book, something very traumatic happens. I should mention that this is a horror book. This is a horror book. And at the beginning of the book, something very traumatic happens between her 2 daughters, and Rob decides to take her oldest daughter to Sundial, which is this property in the Mojave Desert where Rob grew up. And we follow both Rob and her daughter Callie in present day at Sundial, as well as Rob in the past as she's kind of growing up at Sundial. And through that past perspective, we kind of learn about Rob's very mysterious and strange past. And we kind of learn everything that's led up to her daughter Callie behaving extremely strangely and collecting tiny bones and talking to ghosts. That feels like a really bad summary of this book, but there's a lot happening in here. There's like a lot. So I spent most of this book being very confused and frustrated and feeling like I didn't understand what was going on. I learned later in the book that that was probably intentional, and everything does kind of come together at the end and make sense. But I still found my experience of reading this book very frustrating for most of it. So that wasn't great. However, by the end I did have some appreciation of what Catriona Ward did in this book. So I ended up giving this a 3.5 star, although I will say that my reading experience wasn't the best. I just think that there was too much going on in this book. There's all those timelines and perspectives that I already talked about, but there's also like a book within a book aspect to this, which I think could have been omitted and the book would have been just as good. And there's also just like so much happening. So this is like a heavy trigger warning book. There's like scientific experimentation, animal abuse, child abuse, psychological abuse, domestic abuse, literally every type of abuse. And there's also ghosts, and it's a lot. In the end though, again, this was a 3.5 star book. I would recommend it, but definitely please look into the trigger warnings for this one. I listed all the ones that I could think of, but there are probably more, so yeah. The last book that I read in October was A Court of Frost and Starlight by Sarah J. Maas. I am not going to give a summary for this book because it's the novella in the A Court of Thorns and Roses series that comes after the third book. So I really can't say a single thing about this book without spoiling multiple other books. So I'm just not going to summarize it. But like most of the books in this wrap-up, this book was a 3-star book. It was just okay. It basically follows all of our main characters as they choose Christmas presents for each other. Like, it's all about like Christmas. It's just a little kind of slice of life moment around Christmas. And I did enjoy being back with these characters and being back in this world, but this book is nothing to write home about. It's fine. I'm glad I read it. If you like the ACOTAR series, I would pick this up. It's worth reading, but it's nothing spectacular. So that is it for the books that I read in October. I do quickly want to mention the books that I'm in the middle of, as usual. So I'm currently reading In an Absent Dream by Seanan McGuire. I'm at the very end of that book. I will finish it probably today. And this is the 4th book in the Wayward Children series by Seanan McGuire. I am also in the middle of Heart of the Sun Warrior by Sue Lynn Tan, which is an arc. It actually comes out in mid-November, and I am doing a dedicated reading vlog for this, so look out for that. It's coming out very, very soon. And that brings us to the end of this video. If you are new to my channel, please consider liking this video and subscribing. I put one bookish video out every week, sometimes 2, if I can pull it off. If you're still here, thank you so much for being here. I always really appreciate it, and I will see you next time.